Good morning and welcome to another Saturday edition of our Root Cause Solution radio show. Glad to be here. Last week we decided that I expressed that this week we would talk about autoimmunity in regards to the COVID. Can I have that? COVID infection, and there's a lot of questions and that I'm receiving regarding the new variant and the vaccinations and who shouldn't and who shouldn't. A lot of people are hearing things like, there's so much information out there, right? Especially with social media. It's really remarkable. And all the various opinions that people profess regarding this, COVID, especially when it comes to vaccinations. And I just think that there is just a lot of misinformation. And I think it's just too based on personal opinions and not so much in facts. I'm not saying that people are not presenting facts, but how we interpret these things. So it gets difficult. It's like, you get to a point, it's like, what source can you trust? And it can leave people in a very like a frozen way of really trying to make a decision. And I can kind of completely appreciate that. Which is why I want to shed some light on some things today a little bit that I think are certainly quite important. I apologize if there's some noise in the background that you can hear, some motorcycles going by. Anyway, let's just start with a few things here. First, I want to thank everybody for being here, who is here live, right? We have been trying to go live on the Facebook group specifically and have had difficulties, but I really wanted to make these live chats to our Facebook group. Right, I want to thank you for being part of the Facebook group. Maybe we want to share information, and if there are other people that you know of like-mindedness, please tell them to join our Facebook group so our community can grow, and we can have our discussions and share information, amongst us. Okay, so thanks for being here. So let's just start off with, what autoimmunity is. Right? Autoimmunity is where your immune. Let's just start off by telling you is that in our country, in the Western world, we have basically heart disease and cancer, which are the two leading health crises, right? But the reality is that more people are diagnosed with an autoimmune condition or an autoimmune disease than heart disease and cancer combined. I'm just going to repeat that. There's so much background noise. More people are diagnosed with autoimmune diseases than heart disease and cancer combined. So it's a pretty big deal, right? But there's not a lot of money funded into the research and the treatment of these. So we know more about this, right? I mean, obviously, when it comes to heart disease and cancer, it's scary because we think of death, and we don't really think of death when it comes to autoimmune diseases. But autoimmune diseases can be quite devastating in people's lives. Right? So let's just talk. So an autoimmune condition or autoimmune disease, what is that? Right? You have different systems in your body, but we have what is known as an immune system. And in the job or the responsibility of your immune system, right, is to protect us against things that are foreign to the body, things like viruses and bacteria, other kinds of pathogens, even environmental pollens and allergens and stuff, right? So our immune system is supposed to recognize those as something foreign, and then it should kind of mount a response against that so those things don't cause harm to us. We're going to be exposed to viruses, and we're exposed to these things. We live in an environment, right? But if we have an immune system that's working appropriately, it identifies that and it reacts appropriately to that, right? And takes care of business, and we can go about our business, right? In an autoimmune condition, it's where the immune system is identifying or sees self-tissue, your own body tissue, as something foreign. And it can start to mount an attack against self-tissue, and over time, begin to destroy that tissue, where that tissue or that organ is no longer working properly. Small example would be the thyroid. Right? So the diagnosis of Hashimoto hypothyroid is identifying that the reason why the thyroid is slowing down and not working properly and not making enough of the thyroid hormones, right? So if the thyroid is slowing down, right, it impacts the metabolism of the body. So all the systems slow down. Digestion slows down, we get constipation. Your liver slows down, we don't detoxify properly. Our brain slow down, we get brain fog, we don't think properly. Everything slows down because the thyroid is slowing down. So we don't want a slow thyroid. But the question is, why is that happening? And so like 80% of the times it's because there is an autoimmune response against it. So the immune system is seeing the thyroid as something foreign and is creating an attack against that, right? So if we have, in our country, if the immune system is attacking the joints, it's called rheumatoid arthritis. If it's attacking the joints and it's also damaging cartilages, we call it psoriatic arthritis. It's autoimmunity. If it's attacking your pancreas, we call it type 1 diabetes. It's autoimmunity. If it's attacking the covering of your nerves, called the myelin sheaths, right, we call it multiple sclerosis. So it really doesn't matter what the name is. It's just where the immune system is attacking it. The real question is, why is it doing that? Medicine historically has said that the immune system is confused. We don't know why the immune system is doing this thing incorrectly. We know really today that isn't the case at all. The immune system is doing exactly what it's supposed to do, right? Because the reality is that it's seeing something there that doesn't belong there. Now, just the language, the only thing, and I can say a lot of doctors don't even know this, but the immune system is only going to react to proteins. So in other words, people get concerned about mercury, right? Now, we don't want mercury overload in our bodies, but we all get exposed to mercury and heavy metals and stuff. But the mercury in and of itself isn't the problem. It's if the immune system identifies that mercury and creates a reaction, right? But the immune system is not going to create a reaction against mercury in and of itself. It's only going to create a reaction against mercury when the mercury is binding to your own self-tissue, because then your own self-tissue looks different. So if mercury is binding to your thyroid gland, then the thyroid protein itself looks different to the immune system, and that's what the immune system wants to respond to. Same goes for viruses, right? So we know there are specific viruses that have an affinity for your thyroid. So we know that certain viruses are going to be causing or contributing to activating autoimmunity against your thyroid and turning on Hashimoto. So if the virus binds to self-tissue, the tissue looks different. And then the immune system can identify that and go after that. Now, another component of autoimmunity is that you can have antibodies, which is the immune marker against the thyroid or against any tissue, your joints, your nerves, your brain, your gut, everything and anything. But those antibodies can be sitting there dormant for decades. But something can come along and trigger your immune system into turning it on, and then it goes. The question, can you have more than one autoimmune disease? Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, that is really the big problem. In the medical model, if you have Hashimoto's thyroid, it's just treated with Synthroid or whatever the hormone replacement is. It has to be managed. But the problem is if you're not managing the immune system, and what's driving that immune system is you're going to get autoimmunity against other tissues. The average adult will develop 4 to 5 autoimmune diseases in their life if it's not handled properly. That's why commonly you'll see people with autoimmune thyroid advance into rheumatoid arthritis and vice versa.
Why do women have more autoimmune diseases than
Why
men?
do women have more autoimmune diseases than men? I don't know that to be factual. I do know that more women have, let's say, for example, more women will have specific types of autoimmunities versus men. So there's a higher prevalence of Hashimoto's in women than men. Men still get Hashimoto's thyroid, but there's a higher prevalence of women with Hashimoto's. Why? It's probably because their thyroid is more metabolically active, right? Because the thyroid hormones are also going to be influencing your menstrual cycle. And your menstrual cycle is influencing the activity of your thyroid. So there's a lot more of that metabolic activity that can precipitate it. Women, a big trigger for turning on autoimmunity against your thyroid is pregnancy. So when women get pregnant, their last trimester is their immune system is shifting in a way to produce immunity for the baby, for the fetus, so the baby can come into the world with some degree of protection. And then after they give birth, the immune system, swings like a pendulum in a different direction to protect the mom from dying, basically. So there's a huge shift in the activation of the mom's immune system in that thing. So very often, if a woman comes in and she says that ever since I gave birth to this child 10 years ago, my health has been spiraling downhill, I almost know to the bank that it's an activation of autoimmunity. It's a very, very common thing.
Do people know, like, are there symptoms that may say, I should really check for autoimmune disease? That's a good question.
So the question is there a sign or a symptom that I should check for autoimmune diseases? I mean, the answer is, I don't know how to answer that exactly. The answer would be yes, but there's not a sign or a symptom for autoimmunity. There's not, I just gave you a sign. I just gave you a sign by saying to you, a woman says that ever since I gave birth to this child, things are becoming off. You've got to be suspect that there must be activation of autoimmunity there, right? That's the sign in a way, right? But there's not a symptom. A symptom is, okay, a person's going along, they have, things are slowing, they don't feel right energetically, and then finally a doctor runs a routine blood test and says your thyroid is working too slow. They measure the TSH. Fair enough. We're going to give you some hormone replacement, right? But it should go further, and you should test the antibodies against thyroid to determine whether or not the reasons why the thyroid is slowing down is because of the immune system doing that. Right? That's not usually typically done in the medical model. And the reason why is because it doesn't change their treatment model. That's a big problem, because I always like to explain to people that if we can identify that the reasons why the thyroid is slowing down is because of autoimmunity, it really dynamically changes the treatment strategy. The thyroid still needs support with the medication, but it really becomes an immune management game. That's what it really is. It's how do we regulate? If you're not calming down the immune system, right, it's going to keep driving more and more destruction. Now, how do we bring this around to the COVID environment, right? That's the whole point.
What symptoms are you seeing people talk about, long haul symptoms?
So let's just COVID at this. So one of the things that's happening, right, is people are concerned about getting the vaccination. Now, I can't get into all of this today, there's not enough time, but again, we did a live webinar that is recorded. You can go back and listen to this webinar that I presented back in the beginning of the year about the vaccination and all the information we know about the vaccinations, the pros and the cons, and whether you should or you shouldn't, right? So you can make up your own determination, right? And all I can tell you is that I made my determination based upon the facts and the research that I did, and I chose to get the vaccination, okay? Even though I'm not an advocate of vaccinations in a general scheme of things, this scenario and this playing field is a lot different. This world is a lot different, and I made my decision, okay, based upon the risk versus reward. So when we talk about risk versus reward, right? So we know we have people that get the vaccination, okay, that are concerned that getting the vaccination is going to create a problem. Right? They don't know what the vaccination is, and they don't know if it's going to make them worse. If they have an underlying autoimmune problem, it's a good question. Should you get the vaccination if you have an underlying immune problem? Now, that said, there was a question that came up, and it was referenced, should I get the vaccination if I'm immune suppressed or if I have autoimmunity? Now, let me just clarify that for a moment. There's a difference between immune suppressed and autoimmunity. So I hope I just shed some light on what autoimmunity is. That does not mean that your immune system is suppressed. Immune suppression means that your immune system is not working properly, right? Now, if you were immune suppressed, you would not want to get the infection, right? You don't have your immune system there to fight the infection, and that infection is going to get the upper hand. That's a large percentage of the population. Right? And that's what makes people more vulnerable to actually getting infections and having more dire consequences from being infected. Right? There are so many people, I said this in the last 2 shows, but right, every commercial you see every other commercial you see on television is for a drug. The drug is for depression, for diabetes, autoimmune diseases, for rheumatoid arthritis, for psoriatic arthritis. It just goes on. And every drug, if you listen to it, they say, tell your doctor if you get yeast infections, tell your doctor if you get sores, tell your doctor to get a fever, tell your doctor if you die. Right? But the reason why is because what that says is that every drug that they're advertising is an immune suppressing drug. That's what it is. So what does that tell us? That tells you that the common theme or the common denominator in all of these diseases or conditions, it's an immune system that's running out of control. It's we call a chronic inflammatory state. So they're suppressing the immune system with these drugs, right? And short term may be okay, but long term use of these drugs is they're putting a person into immune suppression. That's not a good thing. If you're immune suppressed, you can't fight viral infections. You're more prone to viral infections, right? You're more prone to cancer because your immune system is supposed to fight cancer, control the overgrowth of cancer cells. Not a good thing. And this is a high percentage of people that we're talking about here. So let's just go to some other models. The other thing I wanted to kind of talk about with COVID, and this is the risk versus reward, right, is that people who are or have been infected with COVID, and I was just reading here, I'm just going to look at it. This just came out from a study done this past June 17th, 2021, in the edition of this magazine called Pathogens, right? And they did a study here of 185 randomly selected COVID patients, right? And they're saying here that 30% develop long COVID symptoms. That's called the long haulers, right? So people who got infected with the virus, regardless of the degree or the severity of the symptom expression. We're not saying that people who had severe symptoms of COVID, those are the ones who are now these long haulers. Long hauling meaning that they're having health complications post the infection, from chronic fatigue to migraines to joint pains, memory problems, chronic cough, skin rashes. I mean, the list goes on. So they're past the infection, but now they're dealing with all these other health complications. And there's not a correlation to the degree or the severity of the symptom related to that. So even people who had mild symptoms or no symptoms, they kind of coasted through it, are now developing these ongoing chronic health problems. These are called long haulers. And the studies are telling us that statistically, you're looking at about 30% of people that were infected. That's a high number. That's almost a third of the people infected now becoming long haulers. Now, which is interesting here is they're also saying that about of these people who are long haulers, almost 67% of them, okay, were positive for the reactivation of Epstein Barr virus. Wow. So people who have COVID have a higher risk of reactivating Epstein Barr virus. All right, let me explain this to you.
Explain that to me.
Let me explain this to you, Cynthia. So there are all kinds of viruses. We live with viruses, right? We don't have a sterile environment. We live with viruses. And there are different kinds of viruses. So there's a category of viruses that we call latent, L-A-T-E-N-T, latent viruses. And these are viruses that live in us basically, and they live in a dormant state. Dormant meaning that they don't really rear their heads, they don't do much, and it's really the job and the surveillance of our immune system to keep them under control. Epstein-Barr virus being one of them. Epstein-Barr virus is associated with mono, right? So kids who've had mono, it's because of Epstein-Barr viruses, right? Which leads to chronic fatigue problems. That's the association, right? But a lot of these viruses are actually passed down from generation to generation to generation. So it's been purported that about 90% of people have Epstein-Barr virus in them. It's not like something unique to a handful of people. We live with this. Latent. That's why we want a healthy, functioning immune system to control this. Another one would be herpes. It's a very common one, right? So people break out with, there's all different variations of herpes, but people get fever sores, which is the herpes. Okay. What happens when people are stressed, they're not sleeping properly, right? Different things, the diet's off, their immune system becomes suppressed, they break out in fever sores, right? Because the herpes is not controlled and it rears its head, right? So it's immune suppression. So what we're seeing, that you say that's what latent viruses. Then you have what are called infective viruses. And those are things like the common cold and influenza and coronavirus. And some of these are stronger than others, such as the virus, the COVID virus that we're seeing today, and now even the variant, which seems to be stronger than the original coronavirus. So that's a problem. So these are viruses that can infect people. There's acute reactions and can be pretty devastating, right? And then we have other kinds of viruses that are more of the long, ongoing, active viruses, kind of peck away at us, which are things like hepatitis or Hep C and HIV. Those are just ongoing active viruses, right? But they're not acute viruses. So we're talking here about the latent viruses. So Epstein Barr virus is one of those latent viruses. So what we're seeing in people who get infected with COVID, right? So you didn't have protection, didn't get the vaccination, got infected, right? Immune system reacting to it. And 67% of these people, this infection is causing a reactivation of Epstein Barr virus. Now, the reactivation of Epstein Barr virus, EBV, can be a trigger for activating autoimmunity. So what we're seeing in people post-COVID infection is we're seeing an aggressive activation or turning on of autoimmunity. So we're seeing basically an explosion of autoimmune diseases post-COVID infection. Not good. So one of the things that we're seeing is we're seeing autoimmunity against the mitochondria of your cells. The mitochondria of your cell is inside your cell, and that's the engine that makes energy. And so, for example, your brain and your heart and your hormones, basically, system uses a lot of energy. They have a lot of mitochondria. And so if we turn on autoimmunity against mitochondria and start destroying our mitochondria, not good, right? We're going to start really having an energy deficiency in our brains, in our cardiovascular system, and even our hormone system, right? So when you start thinking about the risks and the rewards, right? Yeah. So let me just, again, kind of put things, I'm not here touting whether you should get the vaccine or not. I'm just trying to present some facts and some information. Okay. So, right, we know what we're seeing, and I talked about this in the webinar, right? When you make antibodies, when your immune system is making antibodies, it makes it in specific types of cells, right? And it's made in something called a germinal center. So what the research is showing us is that when your immune system is actively infected with COVID and it's making antibodies against the coronavirus, those antibodies seemingly are made outside of the germinal center, which is kind of interesting. So what's happening is that because it's being made outside the germinal center, there seems to be less specificity, and it's allowing that antibody to then cross-react with self-tissues. So there's a higher propensity of turning on autoimmunity post being infected by the coronavirus. When you're given the vaccination, the antibodies that are being stimulated to be produced by the vaccination are shown to be made in the germinal center, and therefore seem to have much more specificity to the protein, to the spike protein. So you're producing antibodies against the spike protein. Remember, your immune system can only react to proteins. I'm going to segue for one quick second because I've had this question before. And I've even gotten this question from a doctor who was asking me about this and was saying, well, all these people are making campaigns, they're anti-vaxxers and blah, blah, blah. And they said, well, a virus is considered to not be living, which actually it is not. It's not living, right? It doesn't reproduce, right? It replicates. It's just genetic material. So a virus is considered not living. So if it's considered not living, how, Dr. Pucci, could the immune system or antibodies respond to it? But what would happen? The answer is no. Remember I said to you, the immune system produces antibodies or reacts to proteins. So it's not reacting to the virus, it's producing antibodies against the spike protein, the protein that the virus uses to lock onto your cell to get inside your cell. Then the virus kind of like loses the protein. Now the virus is inside your cell. And the virus is then hijacking your DNA. And it's changing the structure of your DNA to replicate itself thousandfold. So I'm always confused when people are saying they're hearing about this messenger RNA virus, the vaccine, and I don't trust it. Is it going to change my DNA? Well, hey, wait a minute. First of all, we know that the messenger RNA comes in as information. It doesn't attach to your DNA, it just disintegrates. It just provides information. But we're worried about that changing our DNA when getting infected with the virus itself is changing your DNA. That's what it does. It locks on it and changes your DNA. So it's replicating itself a thousandfold, and then it fills your cell to the point that it can't hold it, and it bursts open. And now you release tens of thousands of viruses that then can start attaching to other cells and infecting those cells. So the vaccine is intended to get your immune. So what the vaccine does is the messenger RNA comes in and it gives instructions. So your DNA gets the instructions, and your DNA then starts to make what? And your DNA makes proteins. That's what it does. It makes proteins in your body. And here it's going to make what? It's going to make the protein that the virus uses, the coronavirus protein. It's making it. And then it presents that protein to the outside of the cell. Your immune system then is going to see those proteins and recognize as something foreign, and it's going to start to make antibodies against those proteins. And I'm explaining to you, they're making it inside the germinal center, which is what we want. So now we have these antibodies against these proteins. So if you are infected with the virus, the antibodies are already there, and they can lock on to that virus's proteins and neutralize them, so it inhibits that virus from locking onto your cells and getting inside your cell. That's how it's supposed to be working. Are there some side effects to getting the vaccine? There can be in a small percentage of people, right? But risk versus reward. What's the risk if you actually get the infection? I'm explaining this, it's pretty heavy. So let's go back to people who have the question about, I got an autoimmune disease, or I got immune suppression, So hopefully I clarified the difference between immune suppression and autoimmunity. If a person has an autoimmune disease, in my opinion, right, that would even stand to even more of a reason why you should be vaccinated, right? Because you don't want to get the infection and then really have even more aggressive autoimmunity turned on, right? So if you have anything going on, you have, if you have cardiovascular risks and then you probably would benefit from some degree of protection, because if you don't have that and you get the infection, the consequences of the infection with the cardiovascular disease, the consequences of the infection with the autoimmune diseases is going to be probably a lot more complicated and a lot worse. Now, if you are an individual person who has a known autoimmune disease, and that autoimmune disease was presently an active flare-up, then you might put the brakes on and say, hold on, I'm not going to get the vaccination right now, because the very nature of getting any vaccination is to stimulate your immune system to produce antibodies, right? But that response is promoting some degree of inflammation. That's what it does. Okay, right? So if you're already in some like really aggressive inflammatory response, you may not want to keep pushing that. That's all, right? But if you have autoimmunity and it's not in an out of control aggressive flare, it would seem, in my opinion, this is my opinion, right, that it would be more beneficial to consider the vaccine at this point, especially that now we're facing more of the variant, which may be stronger than the original coronavirus. So that's my take on that. Yeah. I blew Cynthia's questions out of the water. Okay, so all right, this is a lot. If it stimulates any more questions or thoughts or commentary, and I hope it does, is put them in the Facebook group, so I know that they're there, so I can start to continue the presentation, to answer your questions to the best of my ability, right? If you want to go in a different direction on certain things, let's go there too, but put your questions there so I know what's of interest to you, so I can shed some light on that and help you with your health journey. So again, another good Saturday morning session. Thanks for being here. If you're listening to on a recording, thanks for listening to the recording. Please tell other people about it, share with other people about it. And again, try to encourage them to join our Facebook group so we can make this a more growing and beneficial community altogether. All right, thanks everyone.